This evening, I'd like to discuss finding the unfindable in archaeology. This is actually a very broad subject, so I'll just cover three particular things. I will cover mainly the Ark of the Covenant, I'll cover the Grail, and finally I'll cover Noah's Ark. The reason I suggest the title Finding the Unfindable is these are things that require more than a little bit of faith in order to assume that they're still existing in a way that we can find them. However, briefly, but before going into the main subject, I'd like to discuss Sleeman and Troy. This is somewhat of a health warning because at the time of Sleeman's excavation in the 1870s, very few people thought that he actually had the right place for Troy. The site commonly believed to be Troy at Sleeman's time was assumed to be at a hilltop at the south end of the Trojan Plain. The site has been previously excavated by Frank Calvert as well as Sleeman. Calvert identified Hisarlik as Troy and suggested Sleeman dig there on land owned by Calvert's family. It's notable that Sleeman had no formal training in archaeology. Again, though, there was very little formal training available at this time to become an archaeologist. The unfortunate thing about his excavation is that he aimed at the base of the fortifications. The result was he shot through the Homeric level and attained a horizon that was about 1,000 years before what he assumed it to be. The result was Priam's treasure was not Priam's at all. It was somebody who lived 1,000 years before. In 1872, Sleeman and Calvert fell out over this and other issues. Calvert suggested that perhaps none of Sleeman's excavations had anything to do with Homeric Troy. Be that as it may, it's clear that Sleeman was a self-promoter. He was definitely a very sophisticated user of the media, and he pushed aside people like Calvert to boost his own image. He did leave enough of a positive legacy in terms of people's interest in the Homeric age. This is rather amazing looking back because at the time he was the center of a storm. It's important to realize that archaeology isn't like an easy experiment that you can just replicate. Archaeology sometimes requires a lot of time to prove if somebody is right or wrong. With this kind of health warning in mind, we can then look at the Ark of the Covenant, as was covered so well in the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark in 1981. There are very few things about that movie that have to do with real history, but it does have to do with mythology. And again, with mythology in mind, we can move to Exodus 25:22. Here, the power of the ark is outlined. Again, Exodus 25:22. And there I will meet thee, and I will commune with thee from above the mercy seat, from between the two cherubims which are upon the ark of the testimony, of all things which I will give thee in commandment unto the children of Israel. This is why the ark was so important. Of course, the ark had a factor of bringing a community together. It also was used in warfare against enemies, but more particularly, it was a direct connection to God. It's not surprising that in the Near East, the ark would have been regarded as a direct conduit because the writings on the tablets would have been seen as, again, a direct emanation from God. It's not that surprising that the ark that was built at about the same time would have been regarded also like the tablets. The ark was a gold-covered chest with a lid described in the book of Exodus as containing the 2 stone tablets from the 10 Commandments, and according to various texts within the Hebrew Bible, it also contained Aaron's rod and a pot of manna. Very powerful symbols. During the construction of Solomon's temple, in other words, after the period of David, very much after the period of Moses, Solomon's temple had a special inner room named the Holy of Holies that was prepared to house the ark. Why is this important? It's clear the ark was still important at the time the temple was constructed. When Solomon married Pharaoh's daughter, she lived in a house outside of Zion because Zion was consecrated because it contained the ark. It shows again how important the ark was and how it loomed large in everyday decisions. The Bible next records that King Hosea, king of Judah from about 649 to 609 BC, had the ark returned to the temple according to 2 Chronicles 33:34 and 2 Kings 21:23. Why is this important? The ark was obviously at some other place. It was not in the temple at this time, and so Hosea had to return it. At this time, the Assyrians were weak, and the result was this area was independent of Egypt or Mesopotamia. During the reign of this king in 609 BC, Pharaoh Necho II led a sizable army up the Euphrates to aid the Assyrians against the Babylonians. Hosea attempted to block the advance at Megiddo, and a fierce battle was fought there, and the king was killed. What does this show? This shows that Judah was in some kind of client relationship, and that this could have long-reaching effects. In 587 BC, the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem and Solomon's temple. The problem with intervening against the Egyptians and the Assyrians was that when you play power politics, you can choose the wrong side. At the time the Babylonians destroyed the temple, the Bible records that vessels were removed, and it is assumed that the ark was removed as well. Jeremiah 3:16, according to the King James Version, records a time when the ark would no longer be important. And it shall come to pass, when ye be multiplied and increased in the land, in those days, saith the Lord, they shall say no more, the ark of the covenant of the Lord, neither shall it come to mind, neither shall they remember it, neither shall they visit it, neither shall that be done any more. It's very clear that in the book of Jeremiah, they were speaking about the time of Hosea. They were speaking about a time when the ark would be no more, and they were reflecting on a future where the ark would be no more. This wouldn't lead to a wholesale reappraisal of Israelite faith. This would lead to another age. The book of Maccabees also records this time. Maccabees 2:4-10, written in about 100 BC, says that the prophet Jeremiah, being warned by God before the Babylonian invasion, took the ark, the tabernacle, and the altar of incense, and buried them in a cave on Mount Nebo, informing those of his followers who wished to find the place that it should remain unknown until the time God should gather his people and together and receive them into mercy. This suggests that the ark was hidden before the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem. There are 2 separate accounts. However, the biblical account makes it clear that the ark is no more. Mount Nebo is described in the Bible, particularly Deuteronomy 34, as the site from which Moses views the promised land, and apparently it's also his final burial place. Mount Nebo is approximately 47 kilometers, 29 miles, slightly south and due east from Jerusalem. It's near the east bank of the Jordan River. History does not run cold from this evidence. The Ethiopic Church claims that they have the Ark of the Covenant. Particularly, the chapel of the tablet at the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Axum allegedly houses the original Ark and not a replica. According to the Bible, the Quran, and several detailed Ethiopian texts, the Queen of Sheba, named Makeda, visited Solomon in Jerusalem in about the 10th century BC. Back in Saba, the queen bore a child called Menelik I, from whom the entire imperial dynasty of Ethiopia is descended, right down to the last in the line, Emperor Haile Selassie, who lived from 1892 to 1975. Clearly, this is a bit of history that plays in both to the legitimacy of the dynasty and the authority of the Ethiopic Church. Interestingly, the Ark was not stolen by a member of the line. When Menelik was 20 in about 950 BC, he went to Jerusalem to meet his father, Solomon. When he returned to Ethiopia, Solomon ordered that the firstborn of all the elders there should accompany him. One secretly stole the Ark of the Covenant, which held the Ten Commandments and on which depended the Jewish state for its legitimacy. When Menelik discovered this, he was angry, but he acquiesced, understanding that this too would be from God. A more interesting piece of evidence comes from Egypt, particularly the Valley of the Kings, excavated in 1922, the tomb of Tutankhamun. Among the artifacts found there was a processional ark listed as a shrine of Anubis. Almost immediately after this was published, people began suspecting, is this the Ark of the Covenant? In fact, from the dimensions, it is not the Ark of the Covenant, but it does appear as if this is where the Israelites got the idea of storing valuable things in an ark. The Grail is another thing that doesn't seem to actually exist, but for all that, took on a very important historical significance. Briefly, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade in 1989 discussed the Grail. This movie was set in 1938, as if a crusade was launched to find the Grail. Of course, we know from history that the Crusades had as a goal to recapture the Holy Land from the Muslims. It had nothing to do with recapturing a Grail or finding a Grail. This is a little bit incorrect, but it's important to remember that the Grail still has a lot of resonance for people today. There are many similarities between the Grail legend and the legend present in the Mabinogion, particularly the story about Bran the Blessed and the Arthurian Fisher King later. Briefly, Bran the Blessed in the Mabinogion has a cauldron that can resurrect the dead. The dead are not in the same position as the living because the dead cannot speak after they are resurrected. Bran gives this cauldron to the King of Ireland as a wedding gift because the king has married his sister. Later, Bran wages war on the Irish and is wounded in the foot or the leg, and the cauldron is destroyed. He asks his followers to sever his head and take it back to Britain, and his head continues talking and keeps them company on their trip. The group lands on a magic island where they spend 80 years at the Castle of Joy and Abundance. but they finally leave to bury Bran's head, which is now silent, in London. The site is reputed to have been White Hill, and is thought to be the location where the Tower of London now stands. This is significant because they buried the head of Bran facing France so that it could repel any future invasion. The imagery of the head is important because it encompasses Celtic mythology, that the head was the seat of the soul. It also encompasses Celtic mythology in the power of a cauldron to bring the dead back to life. There are several cauldrons with artistic representations of this taking place. Could it also be that in the 12th century, when the Grail legend was being established, there was also renewed emphasis on ritual and the Eucharist in the church? There are no doubt many strands going into this tradition, and it's very difficult to choose what strand would have given what. However, there definitely is a connection, and there is a very good reason why the real Grail isn't easily found today. The reason, and in fact we can go back to the Indiana Jones movie, is that at the time of Christ, the Grail was likely not important, and it would have been a very ordinary cup that wouldn't have had any real significance. It no doubt would have been lost. Finally, I'd like to say a few things about Noah's Ark. Noah's Ark is an ongoing issue today with the general public, who has an intense fascination. Is there a boat on top of a mountain in Turkey? Today, a large amount of the mystique revolves around dubious testimonials of people who say they have seen it, particularly in the more recent past, say in the 20th century. There are blurry photographs, there are a variety of conspiracy theories, and there's a distrust of mainstream science and mainstream governments, as if the governments, say, of Turkey, America, even Russia, are well aware of the existence of the Ark, and they're covering it up. As with many of these other things, there's a huge amount of faith involved. Is the Ark really on top of a mountain in Turkey? According to Genesis 8:4, the King James Version, we hear that the ark rested in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, upon the mountains of Ararat. This seems to be a very specific place. Does this mean that somebody at the time would have seen the ark, or does this mean that the mountain of Ararat was perhaps far enough away that people wouldn't have visited it regularly, but not far enough away to be completely mythical? It's an interesting speculation. Josephus, in his Antiquities of the Jews, Book 1, Chapter 3, Section 6, writing in about AD 50, has a lot to say about Noah's Ark. I'll summarize here. Now, all the writers of barbarian histories make mention of this flood and of this ark, among them whom is Berosus the Chaldean. He would date to about 250 BC. Josephus continues, when he is describing the circumstances of the flood, he goes on thus: it is said there is still some part of this ship in Armenia, at the mountain of the Corridaeans, that some people carry off pieces of the bitumen, which they take away and use chiefly as amulets for the averting of mischiefs. Hieronymus the Egyptian, which would be about 30 BC, also wrote the Phoenician Antiquities, and Manassius and a great many more make mention of the same. Nay, Nicholas of Damascus, writing at about 50 AD, in his 96th book hath a particular relation about them, where he speaks thus: "There is a great mountain in Armenia, over Minyas, called Baris, upon which it is reported that many who fled at the time of the deluge were saved, and that one who was carried in an ark came on shore upon the top of it, and that the remains of the timber were great while preserved. This might be the man about whom Moses, the legislator of the Jews, wrote." It's interesting that, according to Josephus, already at a very early time, the place where the people would have been saved from the waters of the flood, in other words, the people not in the ark, they were lumped together with the people who would have embarked from the ark. But where is this place? The place of descent, as described by Josephus, was about 100 kilometers to the southeast of the peak now known as Mount Ararat. The site noted by Josephus is in Iraqi Kurdistan. It is not Ararat. Marco Polo also writes about it, and in fact, we have to wonder if Marco Polo was relying on Josephus when he described, and Marco Polo lived from 1254 to 1324. Marco Polo states, "In the heart of the Armenian mountain range, the mountain's peak is shaped like a cube or cup on which Noah's Ark is said to have rested, whence it is called the Mountain of Noah's Ark. It, the mountain, is so broad and long that it takes more than 2 days to go around it. On the summit, the snow lies so deep all the year round that no one can ever climb it. This snow never entirely melts, but the new snow is forever falling on the old, so that the level rises." Clearly, one would have to wonder from Marco Polo's account, if the snow is so thick and no one ever goes there, how does anyone know about it? There were 19th century expeditions, largely fruitless, and modern searches. The modern searches, in 1949, Aaron J. Smith, Dean of the People Bibles College in Greensboro, North Carolina, he led an unsuccessful expedition to locate the Ark. Former astronaut James Irwin led 2 expeditions to Ararat in the 1980s. He was kidnapped once, but found no tangible evidence of the Ark. As he says, "I've done all I possibly can," he said, "but the Ark continues to elude us." Clearly, finding a few fragments of wood on top of a mountain, or seeing a geological structure that has some sort of form, doesn't prove that there was an Ark. Archaeologists would need a lot of evidence, a lot of datable evidence, to convince them that indeed Noah's Ark lies on top of a mountain. I'd like to say a few things about xenoarchaeology. Xenoarchaeology is a hypothetical form of archaeology that exists mainly in the work of science fiction. Xenoarchaeology is not currently practiced by mainstream archaeologists because there is a current lack of material. Xenoarchaeology is the study of alien life, past alien life, using material remains. Obviously, as soon as anyone finds any material remains of alien life, there will be a field devoted to it very quickly. But before that happens, it's more speculative than real. With so many of these things, the historical evidence is not clear. There's no clear chain of existence to the present. Archaeologists try to keep an open mind and explore a site without preconceived notions. The search for things like the Grail or the Ark, that would involve following a historical trail and would be something more like treasure hunting than scientific archaeology. Perhaps these things belong in the realm of fiction, but of course, if anyone finds any evidence, archaeologists will be right there to help explore. Thank you very much.